thing before we get going? Great. So welcome to Spiral Dynamics Live. I'm Bet Bullhofer. I'll be your host today. And I'm going to be hosting a discussion with Nish Dubashia on his two models of reality, the circle model and the diamond model, which he created in his earlier part of his life. And I love it because it's like mathematics coming in, mixing with spirituality and visions of the world. So it's got so much of that left brain pieces coming in and trying to organize the right hemisphere of the brain. That's kind of how I think about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nish to do a little intro before we go into questions and discussion. So Nish, go ahead and take it over.
Thank you very much, Bet. Thank you for inviting me here today. So what I'd like to do first is to just run through both of these models very quickly, talk my way through them, talk a little bit about the inspiration behind them and what they're trying to do and what they're not trying to do. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. Bet, have I got the ability to share the screen?
Paul is going to be your technical host, so he'll let you have.
You can share your screen, Nish.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'll begin with this screen here. So I became interested in religion, spirituality at a very young age. And when I was a student at university, my passion became to try to find out, is there anything that these different religions, spiritual traditions have in common? And can we kind of condense or distill this commonality in the simplest way that we possibly can, without leaving anything out, but without having anything superfluous in there either? And after several years, I was sort of sitting in meditation, which I used to do quite seriously, still do quite seriously. And this strange diamond-looking shape kind of just appeared in my consciousness. And
hey, Nish, can you click slideshow so we can see the whole screen?
Yes, certainly. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Great. And so I drew out what I was seeing, and it gradually developed into what has come to be known as the diamond model. So I'll give a very quick summary of the diamond model, and then of course, in our discussions, we can go into more detail or however we want to do that. So one of the things I started to notice was that most of these traditions were suggesting or proposing that underneath this normal world in which we live, this normal world of separate things, separate events in 3 dimensions, what most of us just call the world, which I've indicated on this diamond model here as multiplicity. That's basically just the world of parts, the world of multiple things in which we live. Most of the traditions seem to be suggesting or proposing that underneath this apparent world of multiplicity, there's some kind of realm of unity or wholeness or oneness, of which this realm of multiplicity is some kind of manifestation, creation, appearance. And that's what I've denoted here as the whole. And again, many of these traditions, most of these traditions seem to suggest in their own very different ways that problems that we have in the world, suffering or moral problems or internal conflicts, ultimately come or came because we have somehow disconnected ourselves from the whole. We've somehow lost sight of the fact that underlying the world of multiplicity is a world of wholeness. And when we experience that disconnection, we fall into what I've now here called fragmentation. So these are the 3 most basic elements of this model: wholeness that underlies the world of separate things, a multiplicity, which is the world of separate things as we normally perceive it, and fragmentation, which is our fragmentary experience of the world when we lose sight of the wholeness that underlies multiplicity. Now, one of the questions that many of these traditions also try to address is how exactly does the whole become multiplicity? And most of them suggest that there is this intermediary realm that they refer to as the subtle realm. And in this subtle realm, one of the primary things that takes place is that a primary dualism or primary separation takes place between what I'm calling the subject and the object. In other words, a separation is created between a presumption of separate self and the implication of that, which is that there is a separate objective world. And in a way, that's the first multiplicity that takes place. So the whole splits in our experience into subject, object, self and other, and then we carry on making more and more distinctions in the objective world and within the subjective world as well to create a world of multiplicity. And then that later fragments as we lose touch with the whole. Now, ultimately, the whole and multiplicity are not really separate. They're two aspects of the same condition, or two different ways even of looking at and experiencing the same condition. And that's the ultimate condition, or the ultimate source condition of everything, which I've called non-duality at the top of the model. So non-duality there refers to that oneness, or rather that non-difference between the whole and multiplicity. That entire process whereby the whole manifests as subject object, manifests as multiplicity, and can fragment into fragmentation, I've referred there as creation, or some traditions would call that involution. And the process whereby we are invited to rediscover wholeness through healing our fragmentation, healing the subject object split, and through rediscovering wholeness, is what I'm referring there to as evolution. So that's a very quick summary of the diamond model as a whole. So could I request you all to just mute, please? Could I request you to mute yourselves? Paul, would you be able to mute everybody? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's the diamond model in a summary form. And the second model that I would like to share with you, which is very similar, and I'll point out the similarities, but there is a different emphasis, is what I've called the circle model. So I will now share that. Hopefully. Right. So as I was studying the traditions, especially the Eastern traditions, one of the things that I realized was that there were these basic elements that seemed to be forming the Eastern and even implicitly the Middle Eastern traditions and Western traditions, some basic elements that were forming their basic view of reality. And there seemed to be these 5 basic elements that made up the most simple conception of reality that I was seeing in the traditions. And these terms were being thrown about quite easily: gross, subtle, causal, emptiness, consciousness. Emptiness equals form. And what I wanted to do was to try to bring, in a very simple way, some precision into what these terms actually meant and how these different terms actually relate to each other. And that led to the creation of this, again, very simple looking model, which I came to call the circle model. So I'll run through these 5 basic elements in this model and give a very quick summary of what they signify, what they stand for. So if we look on the right side at the bottom, we have gross. Now the gross realm here is basically the sensory motory world. This is everything that we can perceive through our senses: rocks, rivers, houses, physical bodies. And this is the realm of being that we inhabit when we're awake. When we're awake, not sleeping, what we perceive is this gross realm of things that we perceive through our senses. And that very roughly corresponds with what in the diamond model I was referring to as multiplicity, the world of separate things perceived through our senses. Now, as we move to more subtle, more hidden, if you like, dimensions of reality, we come to a dimension of reality which the traditions refer to as the subtle realm of reality. And this is essentially our inner world. This is the world of emotions, mind, higher mind, the realm of archetypes in our deep consciousness. And this is the realm of reality that we access when we are dreaming. So when you fall asleep at night and you're dreaming, what you're accessing there is what the traditions are referring to as the subtle realm, the subtle dimension of reality. That's your inner world, your consciousness, your mind, and your higher mind. And it's possible, this is where we find images, emotions, thoughts, visions. And it's possible to access this subtle realm through techniques such as meditation, shamanic voyaging, and so on. And moving to the top, even beyond the subtle realm, we have what we call the causal realm. And this is referred to with terms like emptiness, formlessness. And this is where all the forms that are there in the gross and subtle realms are blissfully released, and we fall into this realm of nothingness, emptiness, formlessness. And this is the realm that we access when we're asleep, but we're not dreaming. This is the realm of deep, dreamless sleep. So every 24 hours, usually, we are cycling these three realms: the waking realm with gross, the dreaming world with subtle, and the dreamless sleep world with causal. And all of that together is the realm of change, the realm of form. Some traditions in Hinduism call that the realm of light, because all these different forms, subtle and gross, are different forms of light. But there is another half of reality that Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism certainly talk about, which is that even whilst these three changing realms, gross, subtle, and causal, are doing their stuff in the realm of form, there is a fourth realm, which is referred to in Hinduism, for example, as Turiya. That is our fourth natural state. And that is simply the pure observing awareness that we all have within us of these other three states. So while these other three states are moving around and doing their thing, there's a part of us that is simply witnessing these three states, that is simply witnessing whatever is going on in the world of form. And we refer to that, I'm referring to that here as consciousness, primordial consciousness, our true self, our ever-present self. Ultimately, though, this ultimate dualism between emptiness and consciousness on the left there, and form and light, which is that circle, endless circle of gross, subtle, and causal, even that dualism is ultimately not the final truth, because even both consciousness and form are different aspects of this ultimate reality, which I'm referring here, following in some Hindu traditions, as conscious light. And that is, in Buddhism, they say emptiness equals form. Ultimately, even emptiness on the left there and form on the right there are not different. And you can see the diamond model is kind of the right hand of this circle. Gross is the multiplicity and potential fragmentation. Subtle is where the subject-object dualism first takes place, is created. Causal is wholeness. And then you've got consciousness on the left, always present, and the non-duality between the two, which is conscious light. Now, very quickly, just before we move into the discussion, I'll just quickly cover in literally 2 or 3 minutes the other aspect of this presentation or discussion, which is the Kundalini, which is also very closely related to that circle model. In the Hindu tradition in particular, it is said that in the more subtle aspect of our being, we possess 7 basic energy centers, which are referred to as chakras. I'm going to go through this unforgivably quickly, but we can go into detail later. And these 7 chakras are basically moving up from the base of the body up to the top of the head: your root, sacral, solar plexus, heart, throat, third eye, crown. And these are said to be the 7 basic energy centers that we see that exist up the spine or up the middle part of the body. And they correspond, if you remember on the circle model, to the right side of the circle model, which is the world of form. So root, sacral, solar plexus, that would kind of be gross, solar plexus, heart, throat, subtle, third eye, crown, moving into the causal. So that is the gross, subtle, and causal as it manifests in our body, in the subtle realm of our body. And these are the 7 basic energy centers which represent different aspects of our physical and emotional life. However, if you remember on the circle model, we had a left side, which was consciousness, always already present. And in the esoteric anatomy of Hinduism, and it's implied in other traditions as well, on the right side of our body, just to the right of the heart, we have what is called the causal heart, which is another kind of chakra. It's like a knot, a contraction to the right side of the heart. And that is where, according to these traditions, in our body, that left side of the circle model, our ever-present consciousness, that is where that resides. And the final part of this presentation is to tie this back in with the circle model and the Kundalini. So if you can see there, I've got the gross, subtle, causal on the right. That's the 7 chakras, where you find the 7 chakras. And on the left here, we have emptiness consciousness. That's where you find the contraction on the right side of the heart. Now, the Kundalini is spoken of in the Hindu tradition as a form of energy that can travel around this esoteric anatomy, undoing knots and bringing about different kinds of awakening as that energy travels around our esoteric body. And what you can see, there are different ways in which it can travel around the body. There's arrow 1, causal down to gross, arrow 2, gross up to causal, arrow 3 from form over into consciousness, arrow 4 from consciousness back into form, and arrow 5 from consciousness back into form, back down to gross. And my suggestion is, and I spoke this in a lot of detail in my talk with Suma, is that these 5 different movements of the Kundalini around our esoteric anatomy, which we can see here as moving around the circle model, represent 5 different types of spiritual realization, which I'm calling the yogi, the saint, the yogi, the sage, the adept, and the avatar. Again, these are words that are thrown around all over the place in the traditions. I wanted to try to pin these down and bring some more precise meaning to them, which is what I've aimed to do here in this diagram. So there's a 10-minute introduction to esoteric thinking. So I'll stop the share there and pass it back to Bet. And I'm sorry it had to be very quick, but hopefully you'll get the gist of what I'm talking about there.
That was so great. Thank you, Nish. All right, so the way this is going to work now is people queue up and raise their hand. So how do you find the hand button? It's down under the bar at the bottom. Look for the reactions and then pick up. And we're going to queue. And so the way this is going to work is if you have raised your hand more than once, then you will be put at the end of the stack. All right. So if you come back for a second go, we're going to put you at the end. So that way we can get through as many new people as possible. All right. So first up is Sally, and then I have Barbara and then Steve. So go ahead, unmute Sally and share your thoughts.
Hi, Nish. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Sally.
So awesome to be here. It's so amazing to be with people who think about this stuff on a daily basis, because we're obsessed. So I really want to talk about Kundalini, Nish, and I'm deeply steeped in that tradition as well as therapy traditions. So whenever I talk about this, or what I call the perennial anatomy and how that shows up in our body, people dismiss it as a metaphor. So I would love you to talk about how we answer people who say, oh, that's just a metaphor. These vortices in the body don't really exist. And I think this is a snapshot of the deepest reality in our bodies. But we just get dismissed. How would you answer people like that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the only answer that I think can be given to a question like that, and that same question can be asked about anything really in the realm of spirituality and mysticism, is, and this answer may not satisfy the questioner, but the only answer that I think can be given is that you have to really experience it for yourself to see the reality of it. That would be my first answer. It's suck it and see. If you really want to see whether these centers exist, whether Kundalini awakening happens, whether there is something deeper in our being than just the physical body, no amount of talk or reading or conceptual conversation will convince anybody. The only way to be convinced is to have such a overwhelmingly real experience of that for oneself, that it then becomes impossible to doubt it, because one has seen it as clearly as one can see one's own hand. But in order to do that, of course, one has to take up some kind of practice, and that's the rub. People want answers without actually putting in the work. But if we want to awaken that part of ourselves, which is normally cut off from awareness, the only way to do that is to take up some kind of practice, awaken it, see for yourself. But the second answer I would give, which is perhaps less experiential, would be that there is so much, such a volume of written testimony we have in the traditions of this esoteric anatomy, that we can't dismiss that very easily as metaphor without really taking into consideration this whole wealth of experience that we have before us.
Yeah, that's
So
beautiful, Nish. And so there's the role of the grantees that prevent people from seeing this too. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
right. So essentially, the way, if you recall the right hand of the circle model, we have a process of involution whereby the causal manifests as the subtle, manifests as the gross, or in the diamond model, the whole becomes subject, object becomes part. That process is essentially a process of a progressive contraction of awareness. That open, spacious, enlightened awareness that is our primordial state is progressively contracted through various stages until we reach the lowest level of contraction, or really the highest level of contraction, which is where we find ourselves when we are born, when we're babies or children. So each of those stages of contraction find a mirror as a grantee or a knot in the Kundalini system. Each of those knots effectively represents a stage of progressive contraction from the crown down to the root. So in order to free ourselves from that contraction and reawaken to this primordial state of awareness and freedom, essentially we need to go through this process of releasing and undoing these knots in this progressive manner, in this type of yoga. Why does that happen? There's no great answer to that. I mean, it's just the play of consciousness. It's just what consciousness does. Consciousness plays this game of hide and seek with itself, and it hides its true nature from itself via this process of progressive contraction. And then we are invited to participate in this process of evolution, where we progressively undo these knots that we've been given. And that manifests very much as bodily contractions and bodily tensions. So the types of yoga, like Kundalini yoga, for example, or there's equivalent yogas in Tibetan Buddhism and Taoism, are effectively technologies for opening and clearing these contractions in the body-mind, so that we can rediscover our true primordial identity, which is non-duality.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Sally and Nish. Awesome. Let's go to Barbara.
So when you started talking about sleeping and waking and that sort of cycle, immediately popped into my head the question, do you study neurobiology at all, Nish?
My knowledge of neurobiology is very limited. So no,
Okay.
I haven't studied it in any kind of detail, no.
So folks like Keegan, who do subject-object research, are doing it some without scans. But there's a bunch of neurologists who are now looking at how we reconstruct memories. And it turns out that there's almost nothing there. It's not, yeah, Steve's nodding, right? If you think I need to describe this a little different, Steve, just try it in over top of me. So it's, the usual old thinking used to be there was some sort of actual neural pathway that got coded in the brain for experiences, right? And in PTSD, we still think maybe that happens. It's not as specific an experience in the way they used to think. There was a neuron that was mommy's face, and there was a neuron that was the tree. We've now discovered that that's not at all the way it works, apparently. But so if we think about that constructed version, the question was, what do you tell people about experiencing this? And so you say, oh, well, there's billions of pages of testimony on this starting back, millennia. And the response would be, well, given what we know about neurology, it's nothing but a bunch of hallucinations, right? So, yeah, so, which may not be bad. I mean, we know absolutely unequivocally that the mind controls the body's health, right? And if you're in depression and your hallucinations are all negative, your body falls apart instantly. So, it's not as if this is not an extremely useful way of people visualizing it, but I like some of the Dalai Lama's recent attempts to mesh this with current science. I don't think he's ever looked at this in particular, but where do we go from there?
From the point of view of the diamond model and the circle model, science, as empirical science, what we call empirical science, is essentially a gross-based discipline. And so now, and I'm assuming, I'm taking my stance in the circle model for the moment. From a gross-based discipline, when one looks at what's been referred to as subtle and causal, from the point of view of the gross, which includes the physical brain, yes, they do seem or could be written off or explained in terms of imagination or hallucination and so on. But that also is merely a point of view from a limited space, which is the gross realm. Someone who's awakened to consciousness, for example, would actually reverse that and say, well, it's your gross realm that's an illusion. Your gross realm is actually a dream arising in consciousness. So the way that I see it is, rather than trying to find out what's actually true and what's false, or what's actually real or imaginary, my approach is simply to say, well, we have these different perspectives. And all of these perspectives, science, empirical science is one of those, are all true and valid in their own context. And from that context, the dividing line between real and imaginary, or valid and invalid, is simply drawn in different places. So for me, it's not a question of trying to find the correct perspective or the true perspective, because I think it's very difficult. Any decision you make about that's going to be based on certain assumptions, which themselves cannot be demonstrated within that context. All that we can really say is we have these different perspectives, we have these different ways of looking at things, and this is the way that they relate to each other. I think that's the best what we can do without starting to make a lot of assumptions about what is true and what is real and what is unreal.
You know, I would add one thing to that, Nish, and that is one of the things that I was taught by engineers, not scientists, was, Barbara, why don't you just ask the question, which ones are useful? And it's like, oh, and in which context, right? And as soon as I got that, you know, there's people that if I want them to do mind body work, I need to go pull out the scientific literature and show them that it may keep them from dying in 6 months, right? On the other hand, there's other people who were never taught science, don't believe in science, right? And nowadays a whole bunch more that I do have to bring into this with a religious. And then some of your language is going to be antithetical to some of the Judeo-Christian methods. So we need to move it to a different language, right? So I guess what I would say is it's not about what's true. It's about what's useful to the person within their own biomedic and cultural setting that they're in right now.
I completely agree. And actually, and we probably don't have time now, but one of the things I found with the diamond model is that there are ways to, there are versions of the diamond model that apply to the Judeo-Christian traditions. There are versions of the diamond model that apply to empirical science. So, as you say, we may need to change the wording, the terminology, the context, but that essential pattern, I think, of what I'm talking about just mutates into different versions of itself, depending on what and who we're actually talking to. And that's how we can make this kind of approach useful, or show it to be useful to different groups of people.
All right, thanks, Barbara. Love all the different perspectives. Nish, thank you. And then we're going to go to Steve, Veronica, Bet, Sophia, Josh. So you're
Hi,
up,
Nish.
Steve.
Hi, Nish. Hi. Thanks for that recap. And I enjoyed the 2 videos you did before on this as well.
Thank you.
My question kind of follows on from Barbara's point there about the Judeo-Christian, but I want to frame it in a particular way, which is around concepts of time and progress. Because I guess a lot of the language in your model comes more from an Eastern thing, which tends to have a kind of a more circular concept of time, at least in the kind of the gross realm or in the kind of the multiplicity. But in the Christian world, they tend to have a very linear kind of concept, and the Western modernity has borrowed that as well. You know, this kind of sense of moving from alpha to omega. There's a beginning, there's an end. We're traveling towards some kind of goal, and you see a confusion around this sometimes arising in Western kind of new agey or esoteric things, where they're kind of trying to use Eastern language, but in that same kind of progression paradigm, and everything is for a purpose and all this kind of stuff. So I really wanted to see how you see time, because you use the word evolution, which in the West tends to have that kind of linear, progressive sense to it, but how you see time in this model, whether you see a more sort of circular, you know, or kind of samsaric spiraling type thing, or whether you see a more sort of Western, or if those can even be reconciled in any way in your model. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. I think the model can accommodate both approaches. So yeah, my usual initial presentation of the model is from an Eastern stance, because that's where I've done most of my own practice, and those are the traditions that I know best. But in the diamond model, for example, in a in the Eastern view, we would have this never-ending process of whole becoming part, part going back to the whole becoming part, part going back to the whole. And that, in theory, would be an infinite process. And the journey of a particular soul in the Eastern view would be to keep engaging in this circle until one finds liberation and moves out of that circle. And in fact, in the circle model, you'd move out of the right side of form into consciousness on the left. In the Western traditions, yes, in the typical way they're presented in their exoteric versions, you wouldn't have this never-ending iterative circle. We don't reincarnate, for example, in the Middle Eastern traditions. But I think the essential pattern of whole becoming subject, object becoming part, becoming fragment, and then the part having to rediscover the whole, I think that basic pattern still exists, except that it's only one circle. It's only effectively done once. So in a Christian context, for example, wholeness would be represented by the personal God, for example. The subject object would be the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that first creation by God would be the split between heavens and the earth, which metaphorically we could think of as mind and matter, for example. I know it's taken very literally in the exoteric traditions, but I'm giving an esoteric interpretation alongside that. The manifest world in which we live would be the world of multiplicity. But when we then lose touch with God, we lose touch with the whole. In other words, we reject God, and we find that in the story of Adam and Eve. We fall from multiplicity into fragmentation. The part has lost its connection with the whole. The human has lost touch with its own ground of being, which is in God. And then the process of salvation in, say, the Christian tradition would be, in some sense, to reverse that process. So we have to heal fragmentation to return to multiplicity. We have to heal sin to return to that primordial state of paradise in the Garden of Eden. And then at the end of time, which is the end of the one circle that the Christian tradition will admit to, even that is all brought together and we return back to our primordial state of being with God in heaven. So I think that basic pattern still holds, but it's just the one iteration rather than the endless iterations of Eastern thinking.
Yeah, you mentioned the return to Garden of Eden metaphor as well, which is a bit different to the being with God in heaven, and it also features in the Western utopian traditions. So I wonder if you had anything to say about that, because that's a kind of finding a perfection in the gross realm, isn't it? It's finding a kind of heaven on earth, as it were. So do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I think the Garden of Eden in Genesis, in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, I would say we can think of that as representing multiplicity without fragmentation. But I think in the Eastern traditions, like in Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, the end result isn't simply to go back to the Garden of Eden, because that was just the starting point. We certainly rediscover the Garden of Eden, but we go even further than that and achieve theosis, which is a union with God, which even Adam and Eve didn't have in the beginning. So we return to something greater than the Garden of Eden. So in the diamond model, multiplicity falls into fragmentation, and we would rediscover multiplicity, but we'd go on from there to rediscover wholeness with God at the end of time. That would be the Eastern Orthodox, Catholic Orthodox theology, I think.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let's go now to, I have Veronica is up next. And then after that, we have me, and then Sophia, and then Josh. So please go ahead and queue up, and we will add you to the end of the queue. Veronica.
Yeah, so I have a question that, because I don't come so much from this particular Hindu Kundalini Veda Vedanta I know they're different things, but I don't come so much from that tradition. And there's some language that I've always had a little bit of trouble with. Like, I understand the whole idea of gross, subtle, and causal. And Nish, I went back and watched the videos where you explained these models a little more fully, and it actually did help a lot. And I think it clarified things. So I'm kind of just looking to maybe hear once again, if you can help me to sort of untie the knot in my head, because so the causal state is associated with the dreamless state, but this has always been a strange association for me, because the dreamless state for me is like the closest thing to death, which is the furthest thing from consciousness. And yet the causal state is also associated with enlightenment. And I in your video, you said that the mystics have always been after that kind of going back to that wholeness, that oneness, while in a wakeful state, not in a dream state, or I'm sorry, a dreamless state, not in that deep sleep. So I kind of understand that, but it's always hard for me to believe that in our dreamless state, we really would go somewhere so deep and profound, because it just feels like such a dead, hollow space to me. It feels like, I don't know, because when I think of death, but maybe I'm thinking of the gross state death, it is like nothingness. It's just emptiness in the worst form of emptiness, not with the positive connotation of emptiness. And then I also get a little confused with your circle model. Well, maybe if you want to address that, and then I'll say something else.
Sure. Yeah, I think the dreamless sleep state, which is the causal state, seems like a death from the point of view of the waking ego. So it's the waking ego, that because most of us are identified with the waking state. If you ask somebody what's real, most people will say, well, it's when I'm awake, when I'm not asleep. The world I see and the person I am when I'm awake, that's reality. When I'm dreaming, I'm just imagining that, and then there's dreamless sleep. So most people would identify with their gross body mind, which they can perceive through their senses, and actually is the ground of their senses, and the ego, which is your sense of identification with that body mind, in the gross realm. So what we're afraid of, that what you correctly alluded to, is that when we move to subtle and causal in dreaming and dreamless sleep, the reason it feels like death or nothingness, as opposed to consciousness, in the deep dreamless sleep state, is because we're identified with the waking ego. And from the point of view of the waking ego, deep dreamless sleep is like a kind of death, and therefore not necessarily very attractive, except as a temporary place of rest before you wake up again the next day. However, there is a deeper self that we possess in the Eastern way of thinking, and I think there's also shades of this in the West as well. And that is, in the circle model, on the left-hand side, you had consciousness. Now that is, in Hinduism, for example, in Vedanta, that's referred to as your true self. So your ego self, which is awake in the gross realm, and which we identify with in the gross realm, is temporarily switched off in the deep dreamless sleep realm. But your true self on the left, consciousness, divine consciousness, that part of you deep within that intersects with divinity, that deep true self, divine consciousness, is always present in all three of these states. So even when we are in deep dreamless sleep, from the point of view of the ego, we're temporarily gone. But from the point of view of the divine consciousness on the left, we are absolutely awake and witnessing that deep dreamless sleep. The reason this doesn't make sense to most people is because most people haven't awakened to that left-hand side. So this all sounds a bit abstract and meaningless. When through a spiritual practice over years and decades, if we can awaken to that divine consciousness on the left, then we attain to what is referred to as a kind of a witnessing constancy. So even while we're cycling every 24 hours through gross, subtle, and causal, none of that is anything that's really happening to us. We're watching that as if we're watching it as a movie. And the ego with which we previously identified in the gross waking state is now just a character in that movie. Who we now really are is this true self, divine consciousness on the left. And that is able to just sleep, go through these cycles of sleep, and remain fully awake and fully aware while we're doing this, engaging in this 24-hour cycle. And that's why causal isn't death for the true self, although it can be seen as death for the ego self.
Okay. That makes sense, Nish. It's interesting to think that, you know, people who have had enlightenment experiences that can last a long time or become permanent. But we don't get that benefit from deep sleep. You know, we wake up and it's like, oh, here we go again, another day. It'd be great if we got an injection, a mystical injection every night, you know, when we went to sleep.
Yeah, I'm working on that. I'm working on those.
Yeah, and I thought I would end with a hadith Qudsi, which is a hadith is something that was ascribed to have been said by the Prophet Muhammad in the Islamic tradition. And this is something that was ascribed to him that he ascribed to God. So this is like God, it's something that he sensed that God was saying, speaking to him. And it's something that comes from the Sufi tradition. So it's not something you'll necessarily find in more traditional Islamic sources, but it's something that Sufi masters like Ibn Arabi and Rumi have made references to. Some of you have probably heard this, but it goes, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So I created the creation in order to be known. And it's kind of like this idea of the wholeness wanting to be known. So having to create the kind of fragmentation in order to recognize the wholeness again. So I think there's something reflected in that in all traditions, even though it may not always be overtly obvious.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right what you're saying. And in this looking back to the circle model, if you recall, the original primordial state of being is that conscious light, which is the whole circle. And the first division that takes place is the splitting of that whole circle into two halves via a line down the middle. When we've done that, we've created a consciousness on the left and form or light on the right. So that could be seen as God wanting himself to be known or to become an object of knowledge. So consciousness on the left is God as the knower, and energy, form, light on the right is God as the known. So the very first thing that happens in that process of manifestation is that God himself, herself, undergoes this apparent split between subject and object, and then engages in this process where that object needs to rediscover its true nature in that subject. And I think that matches exactly what you just read. Yeah. And I think we can find similar things in Judaism and even in Christianity, in very esoteric Christianity. Bet, I think you've muted yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Veronica. So I am completely fascinated with the gross, the science. I definitely am very, very into science right now. And I would say that what I see with my own students is that they are ignoring their bodies. They're stuck in the subtle mind of like their worries, their concerns, their, notifications from their phone, and they're not taking care of their body. And so they have heart disease and diabetes and they're not walking. And I'm just like, how could you find 5 minutes to walk every day? And they're like, I can't do that. Stress is like the number one thing. So these are the things I'm seeing in the world with my students and my yoga practice. And so I'm very much grounding them in the gross body. So I'm completely like, how do they get into their senses? People don't smell. People look. They look in this little tiny circle and they don't see. So I play with peripheral vision. And so I'm using the body to try to help them to move up eventually, hopefully. And so I'm thinking a lot about I haven't read this book, but I heard about it called The Master and the Emissary, where we as a society have become completely obsessed with the left brain, where it's all about the parts and process and getting the solution versus the meaning and the purpose, which is more right brain. So coming from the science and coming from like the gross body anatomy, I would love to hear how that brain versus left brain, because I just want to put out there, you are creating a left brain demonstration, a model, right,
Hmm.
of a right brain philosophy of the whole. So
Hmm.
I would just love to hear how you think about that, how because you're trained in mathematics, right? So just like can you talk about your own thoughts on right brain versus left brain and how that has influenced you as you create this and also this like need for us in our world to get the body. The body is real. We have to get the body to a level where we can move up into other aspects. So I'd love to
Hmm.
hear what your thoughts on all that are.
Okay, sure, thank you. Okay, I'm going to answer this question in two parts, if that's okay. So the first part is that I completely agree with you that we absolutely need to get back into our bodies. And I would say that our enlightenment, however we conceive that, is incomplete without us doing that. Historically, some of the earlier traditions in the East, early Hinduism like Vedanta, early Buddhism like Theravada, were very much mind-based traditions. So in Vedanta, for example, one of the key Mahavakyas, which are the great sentences that people are given as pointing out instructions, is I am not the body. And you sit and meditate for like 10 years until you realize consciousness on the left and you're not the body. The danger of doing that is you get sages like Ramana Maharshi, for example, who sat about in that state of I'm not the body while his legs were eaten up by ants. He was so indifferent to his body that he sat there and he was eaten up by animals and he didn't even notice. Now, similarly in Theravada Buddhism, the body is not considered to be, or Jainism, the body is not considered to be very important. But there was this huge shift in the East around about 6th, 7th, 8th century AD with the arisal of the Tantric traditions. And we saw that in Hinduism with the Tantra Kashmir Shaivism. We see it in Buddhism with Tibetan Buddhism, and it was always there in Taoism, where people realized that actually that consciousness, well, after we realize that divine consciousness or wholeness, it's not complete until we bring it back down into the body and until we bring it back down into the realm of the parts. And that's real non-duality. Real non-duality isn't the whole as opposed to the part. Real non-duality is both the whole and the part, which is both consciousness and the body mind. So the body mind, which includes the body, is definitely a very important part of the equation. One of the teachers I worked with a long time ago called Adi Dar, he's written a book called The Enlightenment of the Whole Body. And the whole book argues that real enlightenment is this awakening of the different parts of the body. So I'm in full agreement with you there. Now, your second point, left and right brain. I think that the split between, and this is slightly speculative, but I think it's reasonably valid. The split between the left and right brain is, in the way we normally conceive that the logical, rational, and the intuitive, mystical, is very much reflected in the world, in the human race, in the split between East and West. Historically, if you look back, and this is not a complete, perfect metaphor or correspondence, but very roughly speaking, the Eastern approach has tended to be that, well, life is suffering. We want freedom from the cycle of birth and death. And that higher knowledge, that higher meaning, purpose of existence, that's what's important. And worldly pursuits are not that important. That's kind of been the right brain approach of the East, whereas the left brain approach of the West, certainly since the Renaissance, has more been about life as an opportunity for fulfillment and perfection. We want body-based experiences, scientific knowledge, individual freedom. We control nature. And generally speaking, the more esoteric stuff has been somewhat suppressed. So I think what is actually required, if we're going to move forward as a species globally, is some kind of integration where left and right are both given equal importance. And one way to do that might be to integrate both what is there in the East, what the East has to offer, and what the West has to offer, and bring them together in some kind of synthesis. So we use and employ the waking up approach of the East, and we synthesize that with the growing up approach of the West, states and structures. And I think the highest enlightenment that we can aspire to is the highest states, interpreted, invoked, expressed through the highest structures that are now available to us. So what we don't want, for example, is a non-dual state, but interpreted in very mythic pre-rational terms. We also don't want a very high level of evolution, but no spiritual states with that at all, a purely worldly structural development. We want to somehow synthesize structures and states. And I think if we do that, we will find a way to synthesize East and West, which I think would be a reflection of how we synthesize the left and right sides of the brain. Does that make any kind of sense at all?
That was the best thing I ever heard. Thank you. So integration is one of my most favorite things from calculus. So I love it. This is really, really great. Okay, I'm gonna let someone else talk now. So let's go to let's see. Now next is Sophia. Thank you so much, Nish. And Steve, you're going at the end of the queue. And if anyone else wants to come into the queue, you will hop in there. So we are going to end at the top of the hour. So make sure that you raise your hand. You can see that each of these is going to take a little while. So get into the queue. And next up is Sophia.
Hello, everybody. It's really good to see you. I've missed you all, and it's nice to be here. Yes, actually, to expand on what you were just talking about, Nish, really, because my question, I watched a little bit of your video last night, the first one, and it came to mind that hasn't before, the relationship between consciousness and values. And I don't mean values from an intellectual perspective or only an intellectual perspective, but exactly what you and Beth have just been highlighting about the importance of the embodiment of a lifestyle of your values that reflect your true nature. So what's your take on that kind of relationship between consciousness and values? Thanks.
Right, well, thank you, yeah. I think if we look on the right side of the circle model, which is in the realm of form, what we see there is a development, an evolution of human consciousness, which is modeled in models such as integral theory and spiral dynamics. As we develop structurally on the right side of the circle in the world of form, our values become, for want of a better term, more and more developed, more and more evolved. We get bigger perspectives of truth, beauty, goodness. We're able to take a larger number of perspectives. We're able to see more and understand more complex phenomena cognitively. We evolve morally. Our circle of compassion grows to include greater aspects of humanity, eventually even non-humans and so on. So there is this growth of values in terms of structure on the right side of the circle, if you like. Now, when we have mystical experiences which are represented by states of consciousness, culminating in a pure realization of consciousness on the left side of the circle, when we're not in that state, when we return to the world of form, and we need to find a way to actually live out or manifest that state in the world of form, we can only do that in the context of that level of structural development that we have reached. And I would say that both of these are equally important. Our consciousness, our realization of consciousness, which frees us and liberates us from suffering and form. And the East really does emphasize that very strongly. But it's equally important that we evolve our values on the right side of the model, so that when we find ways to express those waking up experiences in the world, we're able to express those in better and better ways as our values of truth, beauty, and goodness become more and more evolved. The danger is that we very rarely see this balance. Either we get too much emphasis on the evolutionary side, which is great, we develop a better and better world, but we never really experience the liberation that comes from realizing consciousness. So we never go beyond suffering, which is inevitable, no matter how highly evolved we are. And I think that's kind of been the Western pathology. The Eastern pathology has been the opposite. I think the Eastern pathology has been that there's so much emphasis, traditional Eastern, I know the East is modernizing now, but traditional Eastern, there's so much emphasis on waking up and liberation from form, and far less emphasis on the development of values within form, that those waking up insights and experiences in the East, when they're expressed in the manifest world, are often done so in the context of structures that are not as high as they could be. So I think we absolutely have to have both the development and evolution of our values, greater and greater, bigger and bigger contexts for truth, beauty, and goodness, and they become the vehicle or the receptacle through which our waking up and realization of consciousness expresses itself and finds itself in the world.
Yes, that was super. Thank you. There's no way I could have said it like that. But I felt what you were saying. I felt it moving through me, because it was, it's an internal journey. It's an internal exploration, isn't it? I'm sorry about the noise. I'm in a conservatory and it's Wales. It's raining again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sophia. All right. Don't forget to queue up, get in line, raise your hand, be heard today. Josh, you're up.
Yeah, so I appreciate the presentation and the model. I always like models. I tend to be a very conceptual person. And of course, I don't know if the way we look at things, the subtle, causal, gross, I mean, I don't know if our brains are capable of knowing if that's true or not, but I don't have any evidence to contradict it. So, basically on a matter of faith, I'm like, yeah, that's probably how the world is set up. But what I end up seeing, and this will lead into my question for really anyone who has any responses, is this is a generalization, but I tend to see kind of two groups of people that I end up intersecting with in areas of my interests. They're either like really, let's just say, activist focused, and they're like, we got to do stuff in the world. And part of me is like, if we do, definitely. And I've largely participated in that, even though some of it does more harm than good. It's still a valuable thing. Somebody's poisoning the water. We got to stop people from poisoning the water and come up with a better alternative to poisoning our water. That seems pretty basic. And then there's folks kind of who are more in that spiritual realm who almost poo-poo the idea of, it's like, well, you can just transcend the poison in the water. And I'm like, well, I don't, maybe, so basically what my question is how do we take that, you can call it spiritual, it's probably not spiritual. I mean, if these realms are real, then I guess it's actually science, right? But whatever it is, how do we take that and being like, okay, I do know I'm intellectually, I know I am one with the universe. I know that all particles are me, vice versa. that my very, very noisy neighbors are also who I am, but that doesn't keep me from getting very pissed off at their disruptions of me on a daily basis. And I'm looking for a way to make practical this knowledge that we are all one, rather than just, I don't know, letting people dominate me because their lifestyle is more impactful than mine. You know what I'm getting at? So anything on that, in that realm, if anyone has any wisdom, so to speak, I'd appreciate it.
I'll give you my take on that. I don't know if it constitutes wisdom or not, but I'll tell you my approach to that. I would say that when you say the spiritual experience of oneness with everything, are you still there? Oh, there you are. That experience of that, you know, my neighbors are noisy, but I know that I'm really one with them. We're all God. So what do I do? The whole point of the non-dual approach, or the tantric approach, which is what I'm trying to talk about and practice as much as I can, is that we are both the one and the many at the same time. So yeah, we are at one level, at the causal level, at the level of consciousness. Yes, we are all one. We're all different manifestations of that same underlying wholeness, but we're also parts. That's also true. The parts is not an illusion. That's just as real as the whole. So when we're finding a way to bring our spirituality into the world through just practical day-to-day living or spiritual activism, the very difficult task we have, and there are, I'll come to this, but there are texts that deal with this, is to honor both halves of the equation equally and at the same time. We are one with the neighbors. They're also separate, and they're an absolute bloody pain in the arse right now. They're also just different expressions of the same God that I am. So how do we reconcile those? So there's a scripture in Hinduism called the Bhagavad Gita. And the story behind the Bhagavad Gita is that there were these two sets of cousins, and one, the good cousins and the bad cousins. And the bad cousins stole everything that belonged to the good cousins. And the good cousins had to go to war with the bad cousins to get their land back. And that involved having to kill them. And at the last minute, one of the warriors on the good side had a great crisis of conscience. And he said, how can I go and kill my cousins here? How can I just go and slaughter members of my family to get my land back? I know that everything is God, and so on and so on. And the answer he was given by Krishna, who was driving his chariot, and Krishna is one of the gods in Hinduism, was that, yes, essentially, and I'll put it very crudely, think of God and then murder your cousins. In other words, understand that, yes, at some level, there is this wholeness. That's absolutely true. And that won't be lost, even if you go and massacre the shit out of your cousins. Wholeness and God will still be there. But in the realm of the manifest world, you have to act. We're here to act. We're not here to not act. Manifestation wasn't a mistake. We're here to fulfill our duty, to fulfill our purpose. And right now, your purpose is to go and kill your cousins. So that's an extreme example, but that's basically the paradox that we have to work with between the whole and the part, between God and the world. Realize God, be seated in God, realize consciousness, realize that who you really are is the divine, but then do what you need to do in this world. And ultimately, even if you have to go and shoot your neighbor, it doesn't really, if that's what you absolutely have to do, it doesn't affect the fact that all of this is still God. So you situate yourself in consciousness, but then you act in the world to the best of your ability at the highest level of evolution that you are capable of doing. So in a way, we're living this kind of dual life, but it's really a non-dual life. We're both God and the world at the same time. God is stillness, the world is action. Remain in that whole point of stillness as God, act as you need to act in the world to the best of your ability, given the highest level of evolution you have. And if that means acts of apparent aggression, well, there's a place for that. That doesn't change the fact that everybody is God.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just so there's no confusion on the recording, we're not advocating violence. You know, the act of shooting would, in our modern society, would be to take them to court. All right.
Yes.
Next up,
That was absolutely just an example. I'm not suggesting for a moment you should go and shoot your neighbor.
yes, if they've done some kind of illegal crime, then make sure you go to court with them. Okay, next up is Paul, and then we have Maria, and then Steve. Don't forget to queue up Paul.
Thank you, Nish. Your two models are very familiar at one level, but yet you gave me some new insights. You may have just answered the question that I'm about to ask. If I think about it more, I may clarify that even more. I have, being totally honest, I have never had what I would call a meaningful experience with my higher self, my true self, with the causal level, however you want to put it. So this question has to do with relationship. I'll contextualize it that, I'll use this group as an example. I have a gross self, you, Nish, have a gross self, Bet has a gross self. At some level, at this gross level, we have a relationship with each other. Our consciousness, our conscious awareness, our witness, if you will, is aware of the three of us at the gross level. And I guess this is the part that I don't fully get, probably because I haven't had an experience with it. Does that relationship hold at the true self level? Or does somehow the subtle level, the God level, gobble up the self? Does that make sense?
Can you elaborate? I'm not quite getting what you're asking. Sorry.
Okay. I guess I'm trying to understand, is there, okay, I have a gross self, I have a true self. You have a gross self, you have a true self. But we all have our own gross selves and we all have our true selves. I think we all pretty well understand the idea of relationship with each other as individuals at the gross level. Does that relationship exist at the causal level?
Okay, I get you. So what you're saying is, do our true selves have a relationship with each other?
Yes, there you go. As individuals. In other words, I'll just shut up because if I ask more questions, I think you probably have a better understanding of what I'm asking than I do.
I would say the answer to that is no, because there is only one true self. Your true self is my true self, is my cat's true self, is everybody else's true self. It's when we reach the level of causal or consciousness, we're at the level of one, not many. So there aren't many of these true selves. There's only the one true self. And it's that one true self, that one divine consciousness that's looking out through each of our eyes and seeing these lots of different gross bodies. So there's lots of gross bodies, lots of subtle selves even, but insofar as we can use numbers here, there's only the one true self and the one divine consciousness. So no, there's no, at least this is the way that I would understand it, that your true self and my true self, that's where we meet, that's where we converge and we become one with each other. That's the level of oneness between people, is not so much at the gross realm, it's at the causal realm, where we literally meet at the in that one true self, which we all are.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Next up is Maria.
Hi, Nish.
Hi, Marie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for your generously giving your time here today.
You're very welcome.
My question for you is, Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic field. What role does that have, if any, in one or both of your models?
So I would say that Sheldrake's morphogenetic field would probably belong in that area that we refer to as the subtle. That's in the subtle realm. So it's clearly not in the gross realm. It's not perceivable to our senses, these kind of morphogenetic fields that Sheldrake is talking about. But it's also not causal emptiness either. If I've understood Sheldrake correctly, these are like energy fields that enfold information about the development of form, habits, and that would belong in what in this model would be the subtle realm, that the realm of subtle energy. That's kind of where it's at a more subtle dimension than gross, and it then informs the gross, but it's not so subtle as to reach the level of causal emptiness, because at causal emptiness there's no information there. That's just nothingness. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Maria. Okay, so now we're going into repeats, and I'm just going to do a real quick call for anyone new who just wants to pop in here before we go back to the good old regulars, meaning me and Steve and Barbara. So anyone want to jump in? I'm just calling right now for anyone new. All right, Angelica, do you want to speak? So you're going to go to the top of the queue, and so you'd be up right now, and then we go to Steve, myself, and then Barbara. Angelica.
Thank you so much. I'll thank you, Nish, for your invite.
Thank you.
I would just like to jump short in, and I know that's way too high. Probably I wouldn't even understand on the notion of consciousness light. How would that manifest, or what is the vision of it? I understand, of course, and I am very often in my meditations in the emptiness, and I can feel the flow of the energy when I'm in fullness. And yet, how would that, or can you elaborate a little bit on that, please? Thank you.
Sure. So everything that we can experience, any kind of experience that we can have, whether gross, subtle, or causal, belongs to the right side of the circle model, that realm of light. That whole realm of light, that whole circle of gross, subtle, causal, that is the arena in which we have all of our experiences. Because that's the realm of change. For there to be experience, there has to be, things have to change, things have to enter into perception and move around, and you have to be able to perceive that. Now, all of that is taking place in the realm of light. The realm of consciousness on the left is that deepest part of you, which is able to merely witness all the experience that's happening on the right side in the realm of light. So the way consciousness and light would manifest in our awareness, stroke experience, would be that if both of these are fully realized, then our sense of identity, our sense of who we actually are, would be stably situated as the witness, that is simply witnessing all experience that's arising. But the experiences themselves that we're having, including the subject that is having the experience, will all be on the right side of the model, which is in the realm of light. And this is where the confusion can arise, because in effect, there's two subjects that are coexisting simultaneously. Let's say, for example, let's take a very mundane example. Let's say I'm having an experience in the gross realm, and I'm walking around in the woods looking at beautiful trees. Now that's an experience I'm having in the realm of light at the gross level. Or at the subtle level, I could be having some kind of mystical experience where I'm seeing deities or hearing mystical sounds, for example. That would be an experience that's taking place in the subtle. In both of those, there will be a subject and there'll be an object. So in the gross realm, there'll be my body, my senses, and there'll be the trees that I'm observing. Both the subject, which is the body mind, and the object, which are the trees, are both interacting experientially in the right side of the model, which is in the realm of light. On the left side of the model, that deepest part of you, which is the witness consciousness, will be watching that interchange between the subject and the object in the right side. So in a way, you've got your big subject, your big self, which is the witness on the left, watching the little self and the objects interacting on the right. That's how I think consciousness and light would interact. And that would hold true even when we're having mystical experiences. Because even the highest mystical experiences are still in the realm of light. When you're identified with consciousness on the left, you've gone beyond the realm of experience altogether. You're just watching that experience happening. Does that, hopefully that answers your question a bit.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I love getting new voices into the mix. Thank you, Angelica. Wonderful. Now we're going to go into our repeat customers today. So coming to Steve. Steve, wow us, no pressure.
Thank you. So my question kind of follows on from your answer to Sophia's question and a bit from my first question as well. But you're talking about structures and states, or structures and wisdom, or whatever. And it's something that kind of is with me quite a bit at the moment, this question. So I had a science training. I studied physics, did PhD in string theory, in fact, and then I know, Nish, you did maths. So you're kind of coming from that angle as well. So in my youth, I was quite a sort of, I loved science. I loved that aspect of modernity, the ability to gain mastery, you could say, over the physical world. I think that's part of the urge in there. It's a sort of, you're beating back, often the images you see, you're beating back the sort of fears of earlier ages where the world felt it had a lot of power over us. And it's almost this sort of, human become God through scientific power almost. So there's all of that. But when you look at the wisdom traditions, you often get this sense that they're kind of fairly ambivalent about the physical structures. It's sort of like you get a sense that a kind of a yogi would be just as happy in a hunter-gatherer tribe as they would be in Mumbai or London or New York, whatever. They don't really care, and they can deal with both. There's some ambivalence there. So I'm sort of feeling into this because I still feel some attachment to structures, and we're all in this spiral dynamics group, which has often been, which in itself has a kind of flavor of moving up the spiral, moving up to more complex structures, bigger values, maybe even I think in what you said, almost an implicit thing that higher levels maybe have a kind of a more capacity for a kind of broader morality, even something like that. But so I just wanted to return to that point and see how you again sort of needle right into that point of how you see that ambivalence versus this sense of moving up some kind of scale.
Yeah, great, thank you. So going back to the example you gave of the yogi who would be equally happy in hunter-gatherer tribe or in New York. So there are two, I'd like to answer this question in two parts. So first of all, I would say that if a genuine realization of consciousness, the witness consciousness on the left, or nirvana, or whatever we want to call it, has taken place, and if one is essentially or exclusively identified with consciousness, which is a very common realization in the East, in fact, it's the aim of many of the traditions in the East, then almost by necessity and implication, one becomes relatively indifferent to what's happening in the world of form. So if one has realized jnana, if one has realized one's true self to the exclusion of the world, which is still the traditional aim in many of the traditions, the whole point of that is to not care about the structures. The whole point of that is that, well, structures, evolution, that is the realm of suffering, that is samsara. The whole point is to get out of there, and then you don't care whether you're in a hunter-gatherer or in New York, because none of that's who you are anymore. You're over here, you're consciousness. Of course, my argument and the tantric argument is that that's an incomplete realization, because nirvana is samsara ultimately. So that consciousness then needs to return to the world, inhabit the world, and realize that the world is actually just part of the radiance of consciousness. It's not separate. Nirvana is samsara, emptiness is form. So that's the first point. The second point is, I'll say, is that most of these wisdom traditions did arise in spiral dynamics terms at Blue. And certainly they're being reformulated now with the work of various teachers, usually in the West, to create orange, green, yellow, even turquoise versions of them. But the root underlying theology, if you like, of many of these traditions is still grounded in Blue. And at Blue, the general approach is you don't live for enjoyment in this world. You sacrifice enjoyment and pleasure now for a reward later. So the very context in which most of these traditions arose was in that somewhat world negating context. As we have evolved, that approach has become progressively less legitimate for people in the world. Consciousness remains the same. Nirvana hasn't changed, but samsara has changed. And samsara is no longer quite as inclined to deny the world as it would have been 3,000 years ago. We don't have groups of wandering ascetics typically wandering around New York saying this is an illusion. That doesn't tend to happen. And so because consciousness is beyond evolving samsara, consciousness can find ways of expressing itself at any level within the evolution of samsara. So I think the resolution of the two is, again, to stand as Shiva on the left. Who we are is Shiva, but we embrace Shakti with all of her movement and dance. And the way that Shakti dances, as far as we can tell at our level of development, is through a process of increasing development and complexification. So rest as Shiva, embrace Shakti, find your true self as consciousness, but then find ways to express that in ever complexifying forms in the world of form. That I think is seems to me to be the legitimate way to make mysticism legitimate now in the modern and postmodern world. We can't just, it's going to be difficult to simply hold on to the pre-modern approach now.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm interested in this sort of concept of metamodern Rosicrucianism. So it's almost like looking at the physical reality in incredible detail. Can its source in itself potentially be a source to realize the immanent? Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to close the circle that way as well. Yeah. Well,
I would say the more complex our vision of form, in other words, the more highly evolved and complex our cognition, the more immanence becomes obvious to us. So the other way of talking about this is rest as transcendence, seek greater immanence. Yeah. And
That's a good formula. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
That's great.
And that's a balance that unfortunately you don't see that much. We tend to emphasize one or the other, but I think the future of mysticism has to be both if it's going to really continue to be legitimate and worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
All right, we're in the home stretch here. So I'm up next, and then after that, we will have Barbara and then Sally. So if you want to get into the queue, now's a good time. So we've been just talking about a
Myron's
lot
in
of
the queue. I think
What was
Myron's in
that?
the queue as well. Myron's in the queue as
Okay,
well.
great. So Myron just joined the queue. Great. Thank you, Myron. You will go right after me. So my question is going to bring us all down from our happiness here. So are we evolving or devolving as a species? So I think we're devolving, and I'm going to bring to evidence to the table that the US death rates for middle age and younger Americans is going up. The causes are drug overdoses, alcohol, suicides, and cardiometabolic syndromes, diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, other things. And yeah, I think this is to me, these are gross body problems that are being stemmed from the subtle. So the subtle, if you think about drug overdoses, there people are trying to escape the meaningless or the depression or anxiety. Alcohol, again, they're trying to escape. And from what I understand about heart disease is that it is, again, really linked to depression. People often get heart disease because they're depressed, or they get depression after heart disease. They're like really, really linked. So the subtle mind in our society is having these really huge issues that are then affecting the gross body. And I would just love for you to address that, Nish. Thank you.
Thank you. The nice, easy questions. Thank you. I think the whole issue of are we evolving or devolving is very complex. And that's not a cop-out. It really is very complex. I think we are evolving in some ways. And I think we may well be devolving in other ways. The world is getting better and the world is getting worse at the same time in different ways, in different lines of development, for example. The danger with these kind of evolutionary models of development, like you get in Ken Wilber or Aurobindo, is that it can become a bit utopian. We can start to think, well, we just need to get with the program and we're all heading towards paradise. We might be heading for nuclear destruction before we head for paradise. We just don't know. Because evolution can go up and it can also go down. It can go up in some lines of development at the same time as it's regressing in other lines of development. And the other thing to make this even more complex is that there are healthy and unhealthy ways of evolving. So, for example, we could have a culture that's a very healthy blue. It evolves to orange, but it evolves to orange in a very unhealthy way. And then it could evolve to green in a very unhealthy way. So yes, we're evolving, but we're not evolving in a way that is necessarily desirable. The higher levels might be failing to transcend and include the lower levels. The higher levels may be guilty of all kinds of pathologies at those levels that would make evolution, that would create evolutionary dead ends at those levels. So I think, in fact, I would say we are seeing a significant degree of unhealthy orange and unhealthy green at the moment. Unhealthy orange, the destruction of the environment, and that's led to climate change, extreme inequalities between the rich and the poor, for example. Unhealthy green, we can get real extreme, what Ken Wilber calls mean green forms of quite aggressive and violent progressivism. And so it's, I think all of this is going on. We're evolving up, we're devolving down, We're creating healthy and unhealthy versions. It's a huge complex mess of all of that. I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer to are we going up or are we going down? Except
All
in this
right,
group,
Nish.
we're going up in this group.
Yay! Yay, we meet every Saturday at 7. Okay, let us now go to Mireen. I'm sorry. I'm not sure totally how you say your name, but you're up next. And then we go to
Okay.
Sally and then Barb.
It's
Barb, sorry,
Myrene.
Barb and then Sally. Okay, say it again.
It's Myrene, exactly how it's spelled. Myrene. Yeah.
Myrene.
Anyway, this may be, I'm listening to all of my learned friends here who obviously have deep experience and deep study in this, and I have studied as well. But as I listen to this overall, which I often try to sit back and absorb everyone's thoughts and ideas, because I feel like I learned so much from everyone, and certainly from Nish's response. So I'm going to ask something that may sound absurd to all of you learned people, but you know, we are looking at this from a causal, gross, subtle perspective, and that is the what, and the how is deeper meditation, deeper study, learning, and so on. But I don't have a concept, and I know that there's also that we're evolving towards higher values of truth, beauty, and love. But I'm just going to drop this into the middle of the pond and say, is there a perception of why this process, why we're doing this, and to what end? Are we to become God? Are we to be enveloped into the cosmos? Like, can there be an answer from all of these perspectives for the why? Why? What purpose? Why is this process and this journey this way? So that's my question.
So great question. Thank you, Mari. So are you asking this question with regards to why is reality structured like this? Or are you asking the question, why should we bother as people engaging in all of this?
Probably both. Probably both. Because I would think that I'm accepting your analysis and your learned response to what reality is, but the latter question as well.
Thank you. So the first question, why is reality this way? I mean, I'll answer from, and every tradition has its own flavor of an answer to this, and none of them are true in any absolute sense. These are just stories that we tell to try to make sense of what's going on, and some stories are probably a bit better than others. The Hindu story is that, and this is very similar to that quote that Veronica read from the Sufi master, is that consciousness, or conscious light even, plays a game with itself. It plays a game of hide and seek with itself. It doesn't want to be merely the knower sitting around in infinite bliss. This is all metaphorical. Don't take any of this literally. This is just a metaphorical, mythic answer to this. So consciousness or conscious light is in infinite bliss as this eternal subject, but it wants to engage in this game of knowing itself as object, just for the sheer hell of it. And in Hinduism, that's called Maya. It's just that, sorry, Leela. That's just a game that God plays with himself or herself. So through this process of the contraction of awareness, God forgets who he is. And eventually he thinks that he's nothing but dead matter, which actually doesn't think at all. Awareness has gone by that point. And then God engages in this game of rediscovering who he really is through a process of evolution. So, and a process through evolution, a process of growing, deepening, widening awareness. So, metaphorical story, God has forgotten who he is, manifested as dead matter, and then that process is reversed as dead matter tries to discover its original identity as God. And it goes through this process. Matter becomes life, life becomes mind. That's kind of where we are now. Mind becomes soul, soul becomes spirit. So through this process of widening awareness, God rediscovers his true nature, which he had played at forgetting. And all these models are just different ways of making sense of this game of forgetting and remembering. This game of hide and seek has a certain structure, and these are different ways to understand that structure. That's the Hindu explanation. I mean, the Christian explanation would be God is love. God wanted beings to love. God creates beings with whom he can enter into a relationship of love. Those beings reject God, need to find their way back into a loving relationship with God. I think that's another way of telling the same story. But these are the kind of explanations of why reality is the way it is that we find in the traditions. Whether they're true or not is a different issue, but that's the way reality is described in the traditions. Why should we bother to engage in all of this? I would say for two reasons, both of which are equally important, I think. The first is to free ourselves as much as we can from suffering. And a lot of our suffering comes from the contraction of awareness. Not all of it. I mean, if I break my leg tomorrow and I'm shouting and screaming, that's probably not because God has forgotten himself. That's just pain. But a lot of our suffering comes from the contraction of awareness. And a lot of our suffering can be relieved through that release of the contraction of awareness into the discovery of our true identity as God, as true self. That's the left-hand side of the answer, if you like, of the left-hand side of the circle model, the waking up side. The growing up side, which is the right-hand side of the model, what's happening, all this complexification that's happening in form and light. The answer there, which is why should I bother with this, is because it's the best contribution that you can make to making this world a better place and to helping others. The more highly evolved you are, and the more active you are in bringing that higher evolution into the world, even though all of us can only do a tiny, tiny bit, you're putting your drop of nectar into the ocean of poison. You're contributing that tiny little bit that you can to make this world a better place through your own evolution and through influencing the evolution of others. Both of these answers sit side by side with each other paradoxically. Number one, reduction of suffering through transcendence of form. Number two, make form as good as you can for your sake and for the sake of others. So that would be how I would answer that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question because we're all in a spiral dynamics group, and we often ask, like, why are we studying? Like, what's the purpose of this, or is it something useful? And I think it comes back to, like, it just helps us be more sane. Like, I think that's something that gets repeated a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you so much, Maureen. I'm sorry, I said it wrong again. Okay, we're gonna go to Sally and then, or Barb and then Sally. So Barb and then Sally.
I love that answer, Nish. It goes to the universe. However, physicists are now saying that despite entropy, whatever the heck that is, the universe has been evolving for billions of years to more complexity, not less. Mm-hmm. And God created a universe that is designed to go to complexity. And if we want to continue interacting with that universe, then that means we need to be part of that never-ending spiral to complexity.
Mhm.
Nice answer. Now, my question though is much nastier. And going back to our discussions a little bit about the difference between Eastern and Western philosophy, right? Eastern philosophy talks about suffering, and the idea behind it is that a good chunk of it is our own, sort of a Viktor Frankl view of life, right?
Mhm.
You know, and the world is what you personally make of it, right? And Western philosophy is not so self-directed. There's the concept of evil, and I don't know. I mean, I guess in your point about go kill the cousins, there's also a concept of, if not evil, of something that needs to be removed from the universe, right? So can you just talk a little bit about the differences between the Western concept of evil and the Eastern concept of suffering?
Wow. Now that's a big question.
I told
So
you I was going to be nasty.
yeah, no, I love nasty. Bring it on. So I would say this is a very, very simplistic answer. We really need to do another session just on this question. A very simple answer would be, I would say the Eastern approach to suffering and the Western approach to evil mirror the subject-object divide in the diamond model. So in the Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist approach to some degree, suffering is something we're doing to ourselves through our own process of ignorance or self-contraction. And therefore, the way we can resolve it is also for ourselves, through our own self-directed liberation. In the Western approaches, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, suffering has been made into an object and it's called evil. So evil, if you like, is the objectification of suffering as something different to us or other to us. And then mythologies are created about the devil and demons who are effectively objectifications in the Eastern view of the different types of suffering that we are causing to ourselves. So I would say both of those approaches are complementary. If you ask, what is the cause of suffering? Is it something that you're doing to yourself? That would be the Eastern approach. Is it something that has its roots in something outside of yourself, which is some kind of evil, ultimately evil root of evil source of evil? That would be more the Christian, Judaic Christian approach. But I think that actually mirrors the subject-object divide, depending on whether you want to place the root of suffering in the subject or the root of suffering, which is evil, in the object. So I would say both of these are complementary approaches.
But you know, we've gotten a Western disease of putting the root of our suffering in the other, right? I mean, if you look at, you know, we keep thinking we're individualists and that's where Western culture is going, but in fact, it absolutely is not. It's going toward blame the other for things that, quite frankly, an objective person might say, honey, you did that to yourself, really, you know? And so it's become almost a disease. It's into our political dichotomies, but it's also into our personal dichotomies of, you know, even the Me Too movement. You know, it was like, and not to say that women are not abused and have been for millennia, right? But to say that somehow that abuse is out there and I'm not responsible for just knocking him flat, because guess what? I got a big movie contract and now I'm a superstar, you know, and putting that out there as something that's being done by somebody else. and we can just see thousands of examples in the West of that issue. We see terrorism coming from places where instead of fixing my own village and fixing my own culture, right? The evil Satan, and I don't disagree with them that there is an evil Satan out there making life miserable for the Middle East, but the energy goes into fighting the other instead of just fixing my own problems. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason of that is because we are projecting our own stuff onto others. And I think part of the growing up process is to learn to integrate our own shadows, our own projections. Should we go to Sally?
Green isn't doing that very well these days. They're doing all sorts of projection of shadows. You know, you can say anything you want except that I'm a white person that has been abused. And it's like, excuse me, you know, so projections all the way up, right?
Barbara, it's I feel like you're, you know, every one of these questions could be its own session. So this is really good stuff. So we are going to end in 3 minutes exactly. So let's go to Sally and just see how much we can squeeze in. And then I will be directly turning off my Zoom and heading to a retreat. So Sally, you're up.
Yeah, I love this idea that love can only exist if there are parts. So that's an interesting thing. We had to become parts so that we could experience love. My question, Nish, is you mentioned, I'm going to take it back to the body. You mentioned an area next to the heart. And I would love to know more about that and about whether you believe there are such a thing as souls. Steve's question was, if you've only got one cycle, that's linear. If you've got multiple cycles, that's reincarnation. What is your thinking on the soul and that place in the heart?
Okay, thank you. The esoteric anatomy, the chakras going up the spine, that represents evolution in the realm of form. Consciousness, which is on the left-hand side of the model, which is the ever-present consciousness, that finds its correlate according to some of the very esoteric Hindu traditions. We find it in some of the ancient Vedic scriptures, and we find it in the modern teaching of Ramana Maharshi and in Adidar as well, is that the place where that transcendent consciousness intersects with the body is the right side of the heart. There is a chakra at the right side of the heart, which is very unknown, but that is the seat of divine consciousness. So full enlightenment actually takes place not just when the Kundalini reaches the crown chakra, because then you've reached the causal, but when that Kundalini energy then falls from the crown of the head into the right side of the heart. And that is when you've gone beyond the realm of form and situated yourself in the realization of transcendent consciousness. And that fall from the crown down into the heart is known as the Amrita Nadi in Hinduism. And so that's where that right side of the heart comes from. That's the part of the body that corresponds in the esoteric anatomy to divine consciousness. The soul, I would say that the gross, subtle, and causal levels of reality find their parallels in the body. So we have a gross body. This is the Vedantic and the Tibetan analysis. We have a gross body, a subtle body, and a causal body. The gross body is the physical body that you can see. The subtle body is that context in which these chakras and are all Kundalini, that's all happening. And we also have a causal body, which is even more difficult to discern than the subtle body. And who we are as a person in the manifest world is this meeting of these three bodies in this one conglomeration, if you like. Now, I would say that when the traditions refer to the soul, what they're talking about is the subtle body. And if I refer to Tibetan Buddhism, now as an example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example. The Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about how when we have physical death, which is what we normally call just death, the gross body falls away, but the subtle body remains. And that subtle body then, depending on the level of realization that has been achieved during the lifetime of that gross body, will determine the destiny of that subtle body. If one has radically achieved radical liberation, then that subtle body will itself just dissolve into the causal, and the causal will die into the conscious light. But if there are remaining unfulfilled desires and aspirations that are preventing that radical liberation, then that subtle body will have within it those inclinations, which we call karma or the vasanas, to fulfill those unfulfilled aspirations in the medium of another gross body. And that is what the Tibetan tradition would refer to as the reincarnation process. We die to the gross body, we have a subtle body, and then depending on what we've realized during the gross body, the subtle body may go back to the light, or it may reincarnate again in a new gross body. But I think when, the true technical meaning of the term soul, I think, is the subtle body, which is different, and it's a confusion that's often made from this radically transcendent divine consciousness. I think that that's not the soul, because that doesn't transmigrate. That's always and already present, even witnessing the entire process of transmigration.
If there's any objection, I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Yep.
Just, all right. Thank you.